Act 2 of The Tempest begins with a conversation among all the nobles in one part of the island. And so we shift from the Ferdinand part of the island to the nobles, the section of the island, to the section of the island involving the nobles. Excuse me. To the part of the island where the nobles are. And the conversation that takes place between Alonso, Gonzalo, Sebastian, and Antonio gives us some background into the play, right? And so this is the second instance of background into the play, and we find out where these men were coming from at the instance that the Tempest started at the very beginning of the play. They were heading back home from a marriage, weren't they? Right? They were heading back home from a marriage, and in the middle of that journey back home to Italy, the Tempest came. And the marriage was between Alonso's daughter, right, and the king of Tunis. And we find out how Alonso feels about marrying his daughter off, not only outside of Europe, but far away from him as well. They remind him of this union that Alonso has arranged between his daughter and the king of Tunis. And when they remind him of the union, Alonso says, "You cram these words into mine ears against the stomach of my sense. For would I had never married my daughter there, for coming thence my son is lost, and in my rate she too, who is so far from Italy removed, I never shall see her again." And so he experiences the loss of two children. One, of course, is alive. We just saw him in the earlier scene, but he imagines the marriage of his daughter to someone who is so far removed from Italy that she might as well be dead to him. Certainly he'll never see her again. And so this is an instance of the loss of two children, but it's also an instance of another type of power consolidation, right? How does one consolidate power? We talked about this in the earlier lecture, but certainly one way to consolidate power is through marriage, right? We talked earlier about usurpation as one way, as another way of consolidating power. We talked about forging political alliances, such as the one that Antonio forges with himself and Alonso, and now here's another way of consolidating power, which is through marriage. And in this particular decision to consolidate power through marrying his daughter off to the king of Tunis, Alonso is dissatisfied, right? He is dissatisfied with marriage as a means to consolidate power. We'll ask ourselves if he continues to feel this way by the end of the play. So he's sad, and remember also that these men are alone on the island, and they get to talking about leadership, and Antonio and Sebastian have their own kind of thinking about how to consolidate power. We'll find out about that in a second. But Gonzalo is given a few moments to talk about his position as a kind of ruler, right? Gonzalo thinks about, if I were ruler. And of course, he doesn't say this in any way to try and usurp Alonso or to suggest that he wants to be the ruler. But again, he does sort of muse aloud, "If I had plantation of this island, my lord, if I were ruler, if the island were a place where one could rule according to one's own wishes and not those of others." We've already seen this, right? Caliban imagines the island this way. Prospero imagines the island this way. Antonio and Sebastian will imagine the island this way in a second. But Gonzalo briefly has a chance to do the same, right? And Antonio cuts him off, and they make fun of him in this speech, don't they? He'd sow it with nettle seed. And Sebastian adds, oh, he'd sow it with docks or mallows. And were the king on it, what would I do? And again, they make fun of him, right? They make fun of how Gonzalo would rule, right? The island. Sebastian adds, escape being drunk for want of wine. And Gonzalo says, here's what I'd do if I had a chance to be the ruler. I, the Commonwealth, I would, by contraries, execute all things. For no kind of traffic would I admit. No name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, tithe, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation, all men idle, all. And women too, but innocent and pure, no sovereignty. And so what kind of a kingdom does he imagine, right? He imagines a kingdom of complete freedom, right? And we might even call it a sovereignty without any government, and some might even describe it as sort of an anarchic kingdom, and certainly some would also describe it as being idealistic as well, idealistic in the extreme, right? How do you run a country without any of these things? Or at least idealistic in form. And when he says all of these things, they jump in and say, yet he would be the king on it, right? They continue to make fun of him. And so it's interesting to know the different spectrum, right? The spectrums of imagining rule over others, right? Right? Gonzalo falls on the idealistic end of the spectrum, and certainly his idea of government is no government, right? And some might call that anarchical. Certainly, Sebastian and Antonio joked that it would be. How do others? Where do others fall in the spectrum of imagining rule over others? Where do they fit? That's something that maybe you want to think about. We also want to ask ourselves, why were these people cordoned off together in this portion of the island? What was the reason for that? And perhaps the answer to this question of why did Prospero choose to put these people together alone on an island, thinking these thoughts and not believing anyone else was alive? And the answer to this comes at the moment when Ariel enters the scene. And remember, Prospero has the power of putting people to sleep. We saw him put Miranda to sleep earlier on. And Ariel comes and he puts everyone to sleep, right? They all feel very, very tired. They all fall asleep. But there's two people who still remain awake, right? And the only two people who remain awake are Alonso and Sebastian, and pretty soon what happens? Even Alonso starts feeling sleepy, and lo and behold, who are the two people who are still awake? It is Antonio and Sebastian. All go to sleep except for Antonio and Sebastian. And once they're alone, right, they are alone to speak their thoughts without having to consider what Alonso and Gonzalo will think. And Antonio says the following lines to Sebastian: my strong imagination sees a crown dropping upon thy head. What? Art thou waking? If Sebastian wants to know, are you sure you're not sleep talking? Because this is crazy. You're imagining a crown dropping on my head? And Antonio reasons thusly: will you grant me that Ferdinand is drowned? He's gone. And again, part of the reason for separating the crew of the ship in this manner is so that Alonso and Sebastian believe that Ferdinand can no longer succeed Alonso as monarch, right? If he were still around, then of course Antonio and Sebastian would not be having the following dialogue: will you grant me that Ferdinand is drowned? He's gone. And then tell me, who's the next heir of Naples? And Sebastian says, Claribel. Remember, the same Claribel, the same daughter of Alonso, who just got married to the king of Tunis, far, far away from Europe. She that is queen of Tunis, she that dwells 10 leagues beyond man's life, she that from Naples can have no note unless the sun repost, the man in the moon's too slow till newborn chins be rough and razorable. She that from whom? And Antonio notes the fact that all lines of succession, all lines of natural succession to the throne of Naples have been cleared off, right? And so what does he suggest? He suggests that we all were sea swallowed, though some cast again, and by that destiny to perform an act whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. These are important lines. If you didn't pay attention to them before, pay attention to them now. What is Antonio imagining? He is imagining that there is an act that they have been set up to perform. What is the act that they've been set up to perform? The lines that follow give a better sense of that. Antonio suggests to Sebastian that Sebastian kill the sleeping Alonso. And Sebastian even notes, I remember you did supplant your brother Prospero. And Antonio says, true, and look how well my garments sit upon me, much feeder than before. My brother's servants were then my fellows, now they're my men. And so what is he doing? He is encouraging Sebastian to follow the actions that he took earlier in usurping his brother. And he is suggesting something even more insidious than what Antonio did. Remember, what did Antonio do? Antonio set Prospero and Miranda off to sea, right? That's how he usurped. Instead, what he's suggesting to Sebastian is far more nefarious than casting people off on a boat off to sea. He suggests that Sebastian and himself kill Alonso, and of course, once they're rescued by the Europeans, they can just make up the story that Alonso was just killed at sea, right? Alonso was unfortunately taken by Mother Nature, and in fact, with Alonso gone and Ferdinand gone and Claribel gone, who is the next in line to succession for the dukedom of Naples? Sebastian is next in line. And so he is suggesting a means of unnatural succession, right? He is suggesting a means of man-made succession to man-made succession as his narrative suggestion, right? And he even suggests, we know that this is a narrative suggestion because the way that he couches his advice to Antonio, the way that he couches his advice to Sebastian, the way that Antonio couches his advice to Sebastian is through using this expression prologue. Where do you normally find a prologue? Don't you find a prologue in a narrative? Doesn't a prologue appear at the beginning, right, of a story or a play, right? And so this is important. Antonio also tries to control narrative in the same way that Prospero used to, we've seen Prospero also attempt to control authority through controlling narrative. And Antonio suggests that everything that has happened up until this point, the drowning of Ferdinand, the marriage of Claribel, all these men being the sole survivors of the ship, all of this has just been a setup. It has been the beginning of a story. The main action of the story is what's to come. What's to come is in yours and my discharge. The only thing that we need to do is take this sleeping Alonso and make him into a really sleeping Alonso, right? By killing him. Once you kill him, we can fulfill our destiny. And again, we have to ask ourselves, why did Prospero sequester these men together in this part of the island? Did Prospero leave Sebastian and Antonio alone because Prospero anticipated that Antonio might make this suggestion to Sebastian? Is that why Prospero sequestered these men in this particular way? The reason why we ask this question is because Sebastian notes, I remember you did supplant your brother Prospero. Sebastian recognizes that Antonio is suggesting a repeat narrative of what Antonio has already done, right? Is it possible that people tend to repeat past behaviors? It seems like in these lines, Sebastian is noting exactly that Antonio usurped one monarch in the past, he usurped Prospero in the past, and now he is suggesting a usurpation of another monarch, right? Antonio is a character who believes in consolidating power through usurpation, and not only through usurpation, but through usurpation of people who have put their trust in him. Remember, Prospero put his trust in Antonio. What did he do? Antonio stabbed his brother in the back. Alonso put his trust in Antonio. Remember, Alonso and Antonio formed an alliance. And now, what is Antonio doing? He's suggesting stabbing Alonso in the back. Is this part of Antonio's personality to do this kind of behavior? And so we wonder to ourselves, if people's behavior is predictable, right? If people behave in predictable patterns, can other people, and here we're thinking about, can other people like Prospero use this to their advantage in order to catch them? And it's interesting, right? Because the situation that they've been put in, Antonio says it's destiny that's put them in that situation. But is that true? Has destiny isolated them in that portion of the island? Is that destiny? Has destiny put Alonso and Gonzalo to sleep? Has that all happened because of destiny? Or is there some kind of grander narrative at work that Antonio and Sebastian cannot see? In other words, they're suggesting that everything that's happened to us has just been a prologue in order for us to discharge and get rid of Alonso. They believe this to be their narrative, right? This is the narrative they tell themselves. But is this an independent narrative? Is this a narrative that is independent of everything? Is this a narrative that comes from their minds, or does it come from their tendencies? And if it does come from their tendencies, if it does come from behavior that's predictable, could it be possible that Prospero is controlling their narrative within a grander narrative? Is it possible that Prospero is controlling their narrative within a grander narrative, which is to allow them to believe that they really can murder Alonso? Now the question is, if Prospero really wants them to believe that, then why doesn't it happen? Why don't Sebastian and Antonio actually kill Alonso? Because take a look what happens. As soon as they are about to take their knives out and kill Alonso and Gonzalo, what happens? Here comes Ariel. Ariel comes into the scene. He actually prevents that murder from taking place. Ariel says, my master, through his art, foresees the danger that you, his friend, and remember, his friend is who? His friend is not Alonso. The friend that he's talking about here is Gonzalo, right? He sees the danger that his friend is in and sends me forth, for else his project dies, to keep them living. And so that's interesting, right? Prospero has a chance to get revenge, certainly against Alonso, by the hand of Antonio, but instead his project seems to have, but instead his project involves keeping Alonso living. What is his project? We wonder exactly what Prospero's project really is. Keep that question in mind. We'll get to that when we get to the later acts of the play. And so what does Ariel do? He comes in, he sings in Gonzalo's ears just as Antonio and Sebastian are about to kill them, and lo and behold, their lives are spared. So, Act 2, Scene 2 transitions over, and that's where the scene ends, right? With them about to be killed, but then spared, saved, again, through the intervention of Prospero. Prospero sets up a murder, but stops the murder from actually happening. Sebastian and Antonio believe that they are about to be the new rulers of the King of Naples, and just as they are about to put that into action, Prospero undercuts it. So we'll have to ask ourselves why. Why is this happening? Keep that question in the back of your mind. Caliban, remember, now we go to yet another part of the island. So notice that between the different scenes, we move from one portion of the island to another. Between scenes, we started with the Ferdinand portion, then we went to the Alonso, Antonio, Sebastian, Gonzalo portion, and now Act 2, Scene 2 takes us to the Stefano Trinculo portion of the island, and there they meet Caliban. And so the second question that you want to ask yourself is, why does Prospero want Caliban to be in the portion of the island that contains Stefano and Trinculo? Why does Prospero want that? Notice that when Caliban meets Stefano and Trinculo and they offer him something to drink, he's never tasted alcohol before in his life, has he? Right? He's been on the island. He's never been exposed, right? Caliban has never been exposed to this man-made thing called alcohol, right? Called alcohol. And for the first time, these Europeans, remember, what do Europeans bring to colonies that they settle? They bring books, they bring language, they bring booze, right? They bring all of these vestiges of civilization, right? All these civilizing influences. And what's Caliban's reaction to the alcohol? I'll swear upon that bottle to be thy true subject, for the liquor is not earthly. And so what does he do? His behavior towards Stefano and Trinculo, remember, these two men are subjects of King Alonso, right? And what does he do? Before these men who are used to bowing down before others, he bows down before them, and he swears to be their subjects. Not only does he swear to be their subjects, he says, I'll show thee every fertile inch of the island, I will kiss thy foot, I prithee be my God. We ask ourselves, why does Prospero want Caliban to be in the portion of the island that contains Stefano and Trinculo? Could it be that Caliban, too, demonstrates expected, repeated patterns of behavior? Could that be the case? The last time some European set foot on that island, what was the first thing that Caliban did? He treated him in a very, very respectful way. He showed him every fertile inch of the island. Remember earlier, Caliban says, this time also I'll kiss thy foot, I'll swear myself thy subject. And notice what else he says. I'll show thee the best springs, I'll pluck thee berries, I'll fish for thee and get thee wood enough. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve, I'll bear him no more sticks, but follow thee, thou wondrous men. So, on the one hand, Caliban repeats the pattern of behavior that he undertook when Prospero first landed on the island, and on the other hand, Caliban imagines that Stefano and Trinculo can replace Prospero as his new king, as his new lord, as his new sovereign, right? So interestingly enough, Caliban repeats certain patterns of behavior, but those repetitions in patterns of behavior also have slight alterations. Caliban hopes that Stefano and Trinculo can take his place. They can do what he is unable to do, which is to kill Prospero, right? And so this is the second instance of grabbing control from a existing ruler through murder, right? The first instance was with Antonio and Sebastian, and what is this? This is the second instance of consolidating power through usurpation, and not just any usurpation via murder, right? The worst kind of usurpation. And so notice how certain narrative trends tend to repeat. And again, if Prospero anticipates these repeating narrative trends, can he then take advantage of their predictability, right? If he is indeed able to anticipate some of these trends, can he then take advantage? Can he take advantage of the fact that these trends can be predictable? And Trinculo says about Caliban, a most ridiculous monster to make a wonder at. A most ridiculous monster to make a wonder at. He says, a most ridiculous monster to make a wonder of a poor drunkard. And Caliban says, I prithee, let me bring thee where crabs grow. And again, Caliban using the natural appeal of the island, right? And again, all of his lines sort of harken back to what he said he did when Prospero first came. And Caliban ends the scene imagining a different way of life for himself. No more dams I'll make for fish, nor fetching and firing and requiring, nor scraping trencher, nor wash dishes, ban, Caliban has a new master, get a new man, freedom, heyday, freedom. And so, Stefano and Trinculo are happy, right? These two men, Stefano and Trinculo, are thrilled to be treated as masters after a lifetime of serving others, right? And so we wonder to what extent Prospero has put all these people together. Caliban, who longs for another master, and Stefano and Trinculo, who have never been privileged, right? Who've never been privileged to be in a position to rule over others. Remember, when someone says, I'll bow down before you, and no one has ever said that to you before, it really goes to your head, doesn't it, right? Power has the same kind of intoxicating effect as liquor, as booze does. And so the scene ends with Caliban drunk on the idea that he's going to be free, drunk on the idea that he's going to have a new master, and Stefano, and of course physically drunk also on all the booze that he's drank, and Stefano and Trinculo imagining that, hey, we don't have Alonso. Remember, in their minds, Alonso's not there. They're all alone on that island. As far as they're concerned, a new order has started. They shall be the kings instead of the servants. And take a look. They have their first subject already ready to serve them. And so that's where Act 2 ends. The next lecture will pick up with Act 3 and 4 of the play.